Ray Carter had always walked as if the whole world were a hallway lined with open doors, each doorway offering a glimpse of something others might miss, something small and ordinary but worth storing away in the back rooms of memory. On Maple Leaf Street, where the houses stood in perfect rows of suburban predictability, Ray's footsteps became part of the neighborhood's quiet rhythm, a soft counterpoint to the hum of sprinklers, the distant rumble of early morning commuters, and the occasional bark of Mrs. Keating's high-strung terrier. His mailbag swayed against his hip as he moved, not with the impatience of a man trying to finish a route, but with the attentive curiosity of someone who observed the world with almost reverence. At 62, with silver hair that defied gravity and half-moon spectacles perched at the very tip of his nose, Ray looked like the sort of man who should be retired, sitting beside a pond feeding ducks. Instead, he delivered letters as if each envelope carried a piece of someone's life, and sometimes he believed it truly did. People often joked that Ray knew the neighborhood better than Google Maps, and perhaps there was truth to that. He could tell you which families preferred Tuesday deliveries because they worked from home then, who always received packages of gardening tools in summer, or which teenagers tried to intercept their report cards before their parents returned. But the part people didn't say aloud, the part they muttered under their breath or whispered behind closed curtains, was that Ray noticed too much. He noticed when someone repainted their fence a slightly darker shade of white. He noticed when the Petersons' trash can was placed 2 inches farther from the curb than usual. He noticed the sound of a window that opened a little more stiffly than the week before. To some, Ray was charming in an old-fashioned, harmless way. To others, he was the most nosy mailman in Oregon. Ray had heard that phrase once at a grocery store when 2 neighbors didn't realize he was behind them in the aisle. He'd smiled politely and pretended not to hear. The truth was, he didn't mind. Curiosity had been his companion since childhood, the thing that made books interesting, people fascinating, and the world endlessly mysterious. But it wasn't nosiness, Ray always insisted silently to himself. It was simply a sense of responsibility. If one passed through a place every day, one owed it attention. One owed it care. And Ray cared deeply about Maple Leaf Street. It was an ideal slice of Americana. Pastel houses with manicured lawns, picket fences, basketball hoops perched above garages, and trees that burst into flaming reds and oranges every autumn. Ray had walked this street longer than some of its residents had been alive. He had seen children grow into adults, seen marriages begin and end, seen holiday lights go up year after year, some crooked, some perfect. The neighborhood, to him, was alive, a creature whose pulse he could feel beneath his feet. Every house had a story, and Ray somehow remembered all of them. He knew the Brodies at number 207 were trying for another baby because the fertility clinic envelopes had appeared more frequently. He knew the elderly Mr. Holloway had secretly taken up painting landscapes after his wife passed away, because he had once glimpsed a canvas leaning near the window and later noticed packages of oil paints arriving monthly. He knew that the single mother across the street, Lorraine, sometimes cried silently at night because he had once heard her through the slightly cracked window while delivering weekend mail early in the morning. He pretended he hadn't heard, of course, but he had walked a little slower past her house for weeks afterward, as if time itself might be gentle around her. Among all the homes, House 214, the little blue-gray one with the white trim, held a particularly warm place in Ray's heart. It belonged to Megan and Thomas Riley, a young married couple who taught at Meadowbrook Elementary. They were kind, soft-spoken, and unfailingly polite. They greeted Ray by name, waved to him from their porch, and always seemed genuinely interested in how his day was going. Megan baked cookies during the holidays and left a plate for him every Christmas Eve. Thomas once spent 20 minutes chatting with Ray about the history of postal routes, even though Ray knew the conversation must have been terribly boring to him. They were the type of couple who made a neighborhood feel safe simply by existing. House 214 had routines Ray could set his watch by. Every morning at 7:30, a light in the kitchen flicked on. At precisely 7:45, classical music drifted through the open window, usually Vivaldi or Debussy, never too loud, but always present like a whispered smile. A pot of lavender stood near the front steps, releasing a subtle, calming scent whenever Ray approached, and Megan often hung seasonal wreaths on the door. Ray adored that lavender pot. Its position rarely changed, and its purple blooms offered a steady kind of comfort. He'd once told Thomas that lavender reminded him of his late grandmother's backyard. Thomas had smiled and said, "Then I'm glad we keep it here." These small details rooted Ray. They made Maple Leaf Street feel like home, even though Ray lived alone in a modest apartment a few miles away. They were constants, markers in the quiet timeline of an ordinary life. But even the most stable timelines could shift. And Ray always noticed the shift first. It began with something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that anyone else would have walked past without a second thought. On a chilly Wednesday morning, Ray approached House 214 and paused. The lavender pot, his favorite detail of the entire block, was gone from its usual spot. He blinked, taken aback, as if someone had erased a word from the middle of a sentence. "Strange," he whispered. Perhaps the Rileys had brought it inside because of the cold. Nothing wrong with that. And yet Ray felt a tiny ripple in the map of his mind, a disturbance so light it barely registered, but he noticed it anyway. The next day, the classical music was gone. Ray reached the mailbox and stood for a long moment in silence. No soft notes, no familiar melody drifting through the window. Instead, the house felt still, closed, as if it had swallowed its own breath. He tapped the edge of a catalog against his palm, waiting for some sound that never came. "Huh," he murmured again, though this time the sound lacked casualness. The ripple inside him grew slightly bigger. Friday brought something impossible to ignore. When Ray rounded the corner, the first thing he saw was the newspaper. Not on the ground, not in someone's hand, but taped across the inside of the windows. Every single window facing the front lawn was covered, sloppily, unevenly, as if someone had rushed through the job without caring about appearances. The lavender pot missing could be explained. The music stopping could be explained. But no teacher, no pleasant young couple, covered windows with newspaper like some back alley hideout. That wasn't normal. That wasn't them. Ray stood frozen on the walkway, holding a stack of envelopes he no longer processed as mere mail. Instead, dread crept down his spine like cold rain. He took one careful step forward, then another. He raised a hand toward the door, not to knock, but to listen. Nothing. Just a heavy silence that seemed to press against the walls. People redecorate, he told himself. People travel. People change their habits. But he didn't believe it, and the neighborhood inside him didn't believe it either. A neighborhood was a symphony of patterns. When one instrument suddenly vanished, the music faltered. On Saturday, Ray spoke with a man named Greg, who lived 2 houses down from the Rileys. The conversation had seemed innocent at first, a discussion about the weather, fall leaves, the new grocery store on the corner. Then Ray casually asked whether Greg had seen Megan or Thomas recently. "Oh yeah, they left for some weekend trip," Greg said dismissively. "Something spontaneous." Spontaneous. That word clanged in Ray's ears like a dropped pan. The Rileys were many things: kind, dependable, organized, but spontaneous? Not once in 3 years had they ever left town without requesting a mail hold, and even if they had, why would their car still be in the garage? Ray had walked the same route for so long he could predict when a couple would go on vacation, when a family member came to visit, or when someone bought a new pet. But this made no sense. The silent house, the missing lavender, the covered windows. The car left untouched. Every detail clattered together, forming a picture Ray did not want to see. "Are you sure?" he asked Greg lightly. Pretty sure. Greg shrugged. Saw someone at their place yesterday. Maybe a friend house-sitting or something. Someone. Ray's instincts sharpened to a point. What did they look like? Greg shrugged again, not noticing Ray's sudden intensity. Didn't get a good look. Tall guy, hat, car I didn't recognize. Nothing weird. Nothing weird. Yet everything wrong. That night, Ray lay in bed far longer than usual, the shadows of his bedroom stretching across the floor like long black fingers. He tried reading. He tried tea. He tried distracting himself with the quiet hum of late-night television, but his mind kept drifting back to House 214. The newspaper-covered windows floated into his thoughts like stark patches of darkness. The missing lavender pot, the stillness where music used to be, all of it circled him like silent ghosts demanding attention. Had the Rileys argued? Had something happened to them? Had a stranger really been inside their house? Ray clutched the edges of his blanket. His own breathing felt too loud. He did not consider himself paranoid. Observant, yes. Curious, absolutely. But paranoia required imagination, and Ray did not imagine things. He saw them, noticed them, remembered them. And something at that house had changed. Something had shifted so drastically it made the memories inside his mind tremble. The next morning, Monday, he rose before dawn. He wasn't scheduled to begin deliveries until 8, but he left his apartment at 6 anyway, claiming a vague sense of punctuality. But the truth was that House 214 tugged at him like a magnet. The idea of walking past it later, when the sun was high and people were awake, felt unbearable. He needed to see it now. He needed to know whether the Rileys were truly gone, whether something was wrong, or whether his mind had simply built a ghost where none existed. The morning air was crisp, leaving white trails of breath behind him. The sky glowed in shades of blue and purple, still holding on to night. As Ray walked, he rehearsed what he might say if the Rileys happened to answer the door. Just checking on you. Just delivering something early. Just wanted to make sure everything's all right. Each version sounded insufficient, too flimsy for the weight he felt in his chest. He turned onto Maple Leaf Street. His footsteps slowed. House 214 came into view, sitting quietly under the faint glow of the street lamp. Then Ray saw it, the detail he would remember for the rest of his life. The front door lock was brand new. A fresh, polished silver latch, so bright it reflected the morning light like a blade. Yesterday, the lock had been old, worn, with a small scratch near the keyhole. Ray had noticed that scratch many times. It had been there for months. Now it was gone. No one replaced a front door lock overnight unless something serious had happened. His pulse quickened. His breath caught halfway through his throat. He took one hesitant step closer, and then a sound. Soft, stifled. A whimper. A child's whimper. Ray froze, the sound echoing inside his skull, scattering every thought except one. Someone needs help. He leaned toward the door slightly, ear inches from the wood. The whimper came again, trembling, muffled, unmistakably fearful. His hand moved to his phone. He had barely pressed 9 when a deep voice spoke from behind him. "Morning. Something wrong?" Ray jerked upright, spinning around. A tall man in a baseball cap stood on the walkway, hands buried in pockets, shoulders stiff, eyes narrow and alert. Something inside Ray snapped taut like a string pulled too tight. He forced a smile, thin and brittle. "Just delivering mail." Before either man spoke again, another sound drifted through the door. A faint cry, soft as a breath but unmistakable. "Please, help." The stranger's jaw twitched. His stance shifted. His hand slipped slowly from his pocket. And in that suspended second, Ray knew with chilling clarity, this wasn't a neighbor. This wasn't a friend. This wasn't someone who belonged here at all. This was someone dangerous. The man's voice dropped low. "You didn't hear anything." Ray's heart pounded so loudly he worried the stranger might hear it from where he stood. But he didn't run. He didn't back away. Instead, something long dormant inside him, the fierce loyalty he held for the neighborhood, surged powerfully through his veins. His thumb tapped the final one on his phone. The man lunged toward him, and the world shattered into motion. As Ray stumbled backward, struggling to keep his grip on the phone, he realized that everything, the lavender pot, the silence, the covered windows, the stranger, had not been coincidences. They had been warnings, clues, a story written in the smallest details that only someone like him would ever notice. Someone had taken the Rileys. Someone had brought children here. And Ray Carter, the man everyone said was too curious for his own good, was the only person who had seen the truth forming long before danger arrived at his feet. As the man shoved past him into the house, slamming the door behind him, Ray's trembling fingers raised the phone to his ear. The operator answered, and everything that happened next would change the neighborhood forever. But Ray didn't know that yet. He only knew he had to follow. And so, stepping into the darkness of House 214, he entered not just a home, but the beginning of a nightmare that would drag him deeper than he had ever been before. Ray stepped through the doorway of House 214 as if breaching the threshold of a different world, one where the familiar warmth of the Rileys' home had been swallowed whole and replaced with something thick and suffocating. The door closed behind him with an echo that vibrated through his bones. For a moment he stood still, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The air inside was stale, coated with a scent that didn't belong. The sharp odor of sweat, duct tape, and fear. It was the same house he'd visited 1,000 times in memory, yet it felt nothing like the home he remembered. The hallway walls, once covered with cheerful watercolor paintings by Megan's students, now looked sinister in the dim light, shadows pooling like ink across their surfaces. Somewhere deeper inside, the stranger, the tall man in the baseball cap, moved quickly. Ray could hear the heavy thud of footsteps traveling down the stairs, followed by the dragging sound he dreaded recognizing. He clutched his phone in his trembling hand, the 911 operator's calm voice in his ear, but his breath came shallow and fast, barely allowing him to speak. "Sir, can you confirm the address?" the operator asked. 214 Maple Leaf Street, Ray whispered. "There's someone inside, and a child. I heard a child." "Stay outside," she instructed firmly. "Officers are on their way. Do not engage." But it was too late to stay outside. He was already inside, already moving, already following the path he knew better than his own heartbeat. He tried to breathe through the fear, steadying himself as he made his way toward the kitchen. Every step reminded him that he wasn't built for this sort of confrontation. He was 62, his knees ached in cold weather, his hands shook when he was nervous. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the child's voice, thin and frightened, echoing somewhere beneath the floors. What mattered was the image of the Rileys, gentle, kind people, caught in something horrific. And what mattered most was that Ray had noticed the signs. Maybe he'd been mocked for it, dismissed as meddlesome. But noticing things might be the only reason someone survived today. As he passed through the kitchen doorway, his foot nudged something on the ground. A coffee mug. One of Megan's favorites, the one with the cartoon fox wearing a scarf. It lay shattered into pieces, the handle snapped clean off as if someone had dropped it mid-panic. His stomach clenched. The silence around him seemed to throb, thick with the residue of violence. Ray swallowed, feeling the dryness in his throat intensify. He inched toward the basement door. Halfway there, a muffled cry echoed upward. A soft yelp, a quick shuffle, and then what sounded like a small body being dragged. Ray's grip tightened on the phone. "He's in the basement," he murmured to the operator, though he wasn't sure she heard him through the pounding of his own heartbeat. "He's hurting someone." "Stay where you are," she repeated. But Ray was already placing a hand on the doorknob. He hesitated for only a second. Then he opened it. Darkness poured up from the basement like ink. It wasn't complete darkness. Some light seeped from the far end of the stairs. But it was enough to make his pulse rise. The faint glow quivered like a candle flame, distorted by movement. Ray stepped down slowly, trying not to let the old stairs creak too loudly beneath his weight. The basement had always been a cozy place in his memories, where the Rileys stored holiday decorations and old textbooks. He remembered glimpsing boxes labeled Halloween, 4th grade math, and Megan's craft supplies. But now the air smelled different, metallic and sharp. Halfway down, he heard a crash. Ray froze, but only for a moment. The crash was followed by a muffled sob. He forced himself to keep going one step at a time until the basement floor came into view. What he saw made his blood curdle. The tall man in the cap was dragging a boy, no more than 10 years old, across the concrete floor. The child's wrists were bound with duct tape and his ankles were tied together. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, and when he saw Ray, his eyes widened with desperate terror. "Help!" the boy whispered. Not a scream, not a cry, just a whisper, drained of energy but overflowing with pleading. The man turned sharply, his expression twisted, eyes narrowing like blades. "I told you to stay outside." Ray's instinct wasn't logic, it wasn't bravery, it wasn't anything calculated. It was something raw, primal, older than fear, older than pain. He lunged forward. The movement surprised even him, but not as much as it surprised the man. Ray crashed into him with more force than he'd used in years. His knees screamed in protest, but he didn't care. His hands grabbed the man's arm, pulling, wrenching, anything to stop him from taking the child. "Let him go!" Ray shouted, voice sharper than he expected. The man grunted and swung his elbow into Ray's ribs. Pain exploded through Ray's chest, stealing his breath. He stumbled, but refused to fall. He fought to keep hold of the kidnapper's arm, fingers digging in with a desperation born of adrenaline and rage. This man had invaded the Rileys' home. He had taken children. He had shattered the quiet harmony of Maple Leaf Street. Ray would not let him walk out of here without a fight. Another blow caught Ray on the shoulder, sending him crashing into a storage shelf. Boxes clattered to the ground, filling the basement with the sound of chaos. Old Christmas ornaments rolled across the floor, scattering like tiny glass memories. Ray bit back a groan and pushed himself upright, the world spinning slightly around him. The man dragged the boy toward the back exit, a door Ray knew all too well. Its hinge had been broken for weeks, catching every time the Rileys tried to open it. Ray had told them to call someone to fix it. They had laughed and said it was on the list. That hinge might be the only reason the kidnapper hadn't escaped yet. Ray surged forward again. This time the man anticipated him. He spun, swinging his fist straight toward Ray's jaw. The punch landed with a crack, and Ray's vision burst into white stars. His knees buckled. For a second he wondered if he might collapse completely. But then he saw the boy again. Saw the fear in his eyes. Saw the helplessness. And something ancient and defiant inside Ray roared to life. He reached out, grabbing the kidnapper's sleeve and yanking with all his strength. The man stumbled, cursing. The boy slipped from his grasp, falling sideways onto the concrete. "You're dead, old man," the kidnapper snarled, lunging at Ray. Ray braced for another impact, but just then a sound sliced through the basement like salvation. Sirens, loud, sharp, growing closer. For the first time, fear flickered in the kidnapper's eyes. He hesitated, glancing toward the back door. That hesitation was all Ray needed. He seized the man's arm, twisting it the way his father had taught him when he was young, a rare skill he'd never expected to use again. The man yelped in shock and stumbled forward. "Police are here," Ray gasped, breath ragged. "It's over. But the man wasn't done. He shoved Ray backward with such force that Ray slammed against a wooden support beam. Pain shot up his spine. His legs trembled. And yet, he stood. He forced himself forward, hands outstretched, blocking the path between the man and the child. "You're not taking him," Ray said, voice low, steady despite the fear tearing through him. The man bared his teeth. "Move." Ray didn't. The basement window shattered as flashlights burst through the darkness. Footsteps thundered on the stairs, and officers filled the room in seconds. The man in the cap tried to sprint toward the back door, but 2 police officers tackled him before he'd gotten more than 3 steps. Shouts filled the room, commands, warnings, radio chatter. One officer knelt beside the boy, cutting through the duct tape. "You're safe now," he murmured. "We've got you. You're safe." Ray sagged against the beam, finally allowing his body to release the tension that had locked his muscles into stone. His breath came in heavy waves, knees threatening to give out, chest aching from the blows. Lights danced around him as officers moved through the basement, securing the scene. "Sir?" someone said, approaching him. A female officer with steady eyes. "Are you hurt?" Ray shook his head, even though every part of him throbbed. He looked past her, toward the child. "The boy, is he all right?" "He will be," she said gently. "Thanks to you." Ray exhaled shakily, relief crashing through him like a breaking tide. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sirens, the voices, the chaos wash over him. He had done what he needed to do. He had protected someone. He had trusted the instincts people mocked him for, and those instincts had saved a life. When he opened his eyes again, 2 officers were leading the man in the cap up the stairs in handcuffs. The kidnapper glared at Ray over his shoulder, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he muttered, just soft enough that only Ray could hear. A chill crawled down Ray's spine, but then the officer beside him rested a reassuring hand on his arm. "You did the right thing," she whispered. "Don't let him shake you." Ray nodded, though the echo of the threat lingered in the corners of his mind like a cold draft. They escorted him upstairs carefully, guiding him past the broken mug, the scattered belongings, the newspaper-covered windows. The house felt even more unfamiliar now, violated, wounded, holding the echoes of things that shouldn't have happened here. But as Ray stepped outside into the dawn, the air cool and bright around him, he felt a profound clarity settle into his bones. He had been right. Something had been wrong. Terribly wrong. And he had stepped into the darkness anyway. More officers arrived. Paramedics rushed the boy into an ambulance. Neighbors began gathering on the sidewalk, staring at the flashing lights in shock. Some whispered. Some cried. Some pointed at Ray with astonishment, as though seeing him for the first time. Ray stood among the chaos, breath shallow, heart raw. But there was something else, too. Something new. A quiet determination that this was far from over. There were still unanswered questions. The Rileys were missing. The boy wasn't the only child, and the man in the cap wasn't working alone. Ray looked back at the house, its door hanging open like a wound, and he felt something tug deep in his chest. Whatever began in this house wasn't finished yet. And Ray knew, as much as he knew the rhythm of his own mail route, that he wasn't done either. The rising sun cast a pale gold across Maple Leaf Street as Ray stood there, breath shallow, surrounded by flashing red and blue lights. The neighborhood was coming awake in fragmented pieces, a door opening here, a curtain being pulled back there, people spilling out onto porches with expressions of disbelief, fear, or the fierce curiosity only tragedy could stir. The air felt colder than it had moments before, as though the house behind Ray had exhaled something chilling into the morning. He wrapped his arms around himself, partly for warmth, partly for the fragile reassurance that he was still standing, still breathing, still alive after what had happened downstairs. An officer guided him gently toward an ambulance. Not because he needed urgent medical attention, but because they needed him to sit, to rest, to allow them to check his vitals. Ray let them examine the bruises forming on his ribs and jaw, their hands professional, efficient. But he couldn't bring himself to fully focus. His attention kept drifting back to the house. It sat there, innocently shaped like every other home on the block, but something about it felt bruised, hollowed out, a scar in the middle of an otherwise quiet street. A pair of officers crossed the lawn, leading the handcuffed suspect toward a patrol car. The man's expression was tight, fury simmering beneath his skin like boiling water under a thin lid. Not the wild, chaotic anger of someone caught off guard, but a colder, deliberate hate, something that suggested a deeper loyalty to something ugly, something organized. Ray met his gaze for just a moment, and chills swept through him. The man looked at Ray as if memorizing him, as if storing the lines of his face in some shadowed corner of his mind. The threat he had whispered in the basement echoed again, and Ray swallowed hard. He didn't want to be frightened, but his hands were trembling despite the warmth of the morning. "You did good," the paramedic said softly, shining a light briefly into Ray's eyes. "You saved that kid's life." Ray blinked, pulled back to the present moment, though not fully. Will he be okay?" The paramedic hesitated. "Physically, yes. Trauma, that'll take time. But if you hadn't stepped in, it would have ended very differently." She paused. "You risked your life for him." "I didn't think," Ray said, rubbing at the tender spot along his ribs. "I just saw a child who needed help." That's more than most people would have done. Ray wasn't sure about that. In truth, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. His brain felt foggy, overwhelmed by everything he'd witnessed. But beneath the haze was something sharper, an insistence, an unfinished thread tugging at the edges of his awareness. There were more children. That boy wasn't alone. And the Rileys, God, the Rileys, where were they? Were they alive? Had this same man hurt them? Or was someone else involved? His mind wouldn't stop spinning. The female officer who'd spoken to him in the basement approached once again. She had dark hair pulled into a tight bun and the kind of practiced calm Ray had always imagined police officers needed in order not to crumble under the weight of their job. She introduced herself properly this time, Detective Erin McLean. Her badge gleamed in the morning light as she crouched beside him. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you a few questions while everything is still fresh. We'll keep it brief." Ray nodded, grateful for her steady demeanor. "I'll do my best." Detective McLean opened a small notebook. "First, you said you heard someone inside before you saw the suspect. Can you describe the voice? What made you go into the house?" Ray told her everything. How he'd noticed the lock, the silence, the missing lavender pot, the newspaper-covered windows. How he'd heard a child crying. How the stranger had confronted him before running inside. He described the boy, the dragging sound, the struggle in the basement. Every detail he could remember spilled out of him, sometimes in jagged pieces, sometimes in smooth recall. He'd always had a mind for details, and now those details might matter. McLean listened intently, her pen moving swiftly. "These changes you mentioned at the house, when did they start?" "About 3 days ago," Ray said. "But that's when I really started noticing things. If I think about it now, maybe some things shifted earlier. The energy felt wrong, like someone trying to erase the Rileys." "Erase them?" McLean echoed. "That's what it felt like," Ray murmured. "Everything familiar disappearing one piece at a time." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Your observations might have saved a lot more than one child today." Ray felt a knot tighten in his chest. "Detective, the Rileys. Do you know where they are?" McLean's expression faltered just slightly, so subtly that most people might have missed it. But Ray saw it instantly. She wasn't just delivering bad news gently. She didn't know. And not knowing was terrifying. "We're searching the property," she said. "We're also investigating a possible connection between this suspect and others who may be involved." "Others?" Ray whispered. "As in a group?" McLean hesitated. "We can't rule that out. I shouldn't say more until we know for sure." Ray felt the world tilt for a moment. The thought that the Rileys had been caught up in something larger, something organized, something that involved multiple children, it made his stomach twist into knots. He imagined Megan's warm smile, Thomas's easy laugh, the way they'd offered him cookies during the holidays. He couldn't reconcile those images with the horrors he'd just witnessed. Before he could speak again, a shout erupted from inside the house. "Detective! You need to see this!" McLean stood instantly. "Stay here," she instructed Ray. "I'll be right back." But Ray couldn't stay. Not completely. He watched her run inside with 2 other officers, disappearing into the dark doorway. His hands clenched. His breathing grew shallow again. Something had been found. Something important. Something urgent. His instinct screamed at him to follow. His mind told him to stay put. His body trembled in indecision. Minutes stretched thin, fragile as spider silk. Then McLean re-emerged, her expression tight, her movements brisk. She approached Ray, her voice lower now. "We found signs the Rileys were here recently. Struggle marks and something else." Ray's heart slammed against his ribs. "Are they alive?" "I don't know yet," she admitted, and the honesty in her tone made the words even sharper. "But we believe they were taken somewhere else." "Taken," Ray repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "There's more," McLean added. "We found evidence of additional children, clothes, small personal items. This house appears to have been used as a temporary holding site." Ray's breath caught. So that boy wasn't the only one. "No," she said quietly. "Not even close." Ray closed his eyes, feeling sick. McLean placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Mr. Carter, you've done more than anyone could have expected. You helped recover 1 child. You interrupted a transfer of victims. You may have saved others without realizing it." "I didn't save the Rileys," Ray whispered. "Not yet," McLean replied. "But we're not done." Ray looked at her, searching her face for reassurance, and found a fierce determination that steadied him. She wasn't giving up. She wasn't walking away. And if she wasn't, neither would he. "I want to help," he said suddenly. McLean shook her head. "You've helped enough. You need to rest." "No," Ray insisted, leaning forward, breath tight. "You don't understand. I know this neighborhood. I know the routines, the cars, the people who come and go. I noticed the anomaly when no one else did. If this group has been here before or passed through here, I might know without realizing I know." McLean studied him, weighing the risks, the value, the practicality. Her jaw tightened. "I can't put a civilian in danger." "I was already in danger," Ray said softly. "And I'm still here." McLean exhaled. "Let me process the scene. I might have follow-up questions for you, but for now you need to go home. You need sleep." Ray wanted to argue again, but his legs wobbled beneath him, and the ache in his ribs screamed a painful truth. His body was reaching its limit. He nodded reluctantly. A patrol officer escorted him to a police car, offering him a ride home. Ray sat in the back seat, staring out at the neighborhood as it drifted past. Maple Leaf Street, normally so calm, so serene, felt like a cracked photograph now. Something beautiful ripped at the edges. Neighbors whispered in clusters, children clung to their parents. Dogs barked nervously. Doors were locked twice, rather than once, and House 214 loomed behind him like a ghost. The drive to his apartment took 10 minutes, but felt like a blur of noise and silence, dread and disbelief. When the officer helped him inside, Ray nodded gratefully but said little. He didn't want to talk, didn't want sympathy or comfort. He wanted answers. He wanted to know where the Rileys were. He wanted to know how deeply this nightmare had rooted itself in his neighborhood. He wanted to know what he had missed. Once alone, he sat on his worn sofa, staring at the wall while early morning light crept across the carpet. His apartment felt cold, too quiet. The faint hum of the refrigerator was loud enough to feel intrusive. His hands still shook, though the paramedic had assured him it was normal after adrenaline spikes. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, rubbing his temples. Images flashed through his mind in an unrelenting stream. The boy's terrified eyes, the kidnapper's glare, the broken mug on the kitchen floor, the new lock, the newspaper-covered windows. He saw them all with painful clarity, each detail sharp as a shard of glass. Details, his greatest strength, and the reason he couldn't rest. He wanted to help the police. He wanted to go back into that house and search every corner, every drawer, every secret space the Rileys might have created. He wanted to run through the neighborhood knocking on doors, demanding if anyone had seen a strange car, a man in a cap, someone unfamiliar walking down the sidewalk. He wanted to do anything except sit here alone. But there was something else tugging at him too, something subtle, a memory surfacing slowly from the depths of his mind. The stranger at the house had said he'd been there yesterday, and Ray had seen something yesterday too, something he had dismissed at the time. A car. A dark SUV parked farther down Maple Leaf Street. Not unusual, not suspicious. But it hadn't belonged to anyone on the block. He'd noticed it because of the dent on its side, because he remembered everything, because he remembered the way it idled for several minutes without anyone getting in or out. Had that been connected? He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat despite the ache in his ribs. He needed to write this down before the memory blurred. He needed to tell Detective McLean. He needed... A sharp knock broke through the silence. Ray froze. For a moment he feared it might be the man from the basement, escaped, returning to silence him. His pulse raced. But no, he reminded himself, that man was in police custody. The knock came again, firmer now. Ray approached the door cautiously and opened it just a crack. Detective McLean stood on his doorstep. She held a file in her hand. Her expression was grave. "We found something," she said, "and I think you need to hear it." Ray stared at her, heart thundering, knowing that whatever came next might unravel everything he thought he knew. Not just about the Rileys, but about the neighborhood he loved, the safety he believed in, the quiet routines he relied upon. He opened the door fully. Her next words would pull him deeper into the truth. Detective McLean stepped into Ray's apartment with the kind of presence that immediately shifted the air in the room. Even though she was alone, without her team, without the flashing lights of police cruisers reflecting off windows, she carried an urgency that made Ray's pulse quicken. She closed the door behind her gently, not slamming it shut like someone in a rush, but sealing it quietly, deliberately, as though the conversation ahead required the world outside to stay muted. Ray watched her, feeling that same unease he'd felt when he first walked into House 214, an instinctive sense that something was shifting beneath the surface. "Sit down, Mr. Carter," she said softly, motioning toward the sofa. Ray obeyed, lowering himself slowly, the ache in his ribs reminding him that his body had not forgiven him for the struggle. McLean remained standing for a moment, flipping open the file she held. Papers rustled. Photos. Reports. Something heavier than simple documentation. She hesitated as if deciding where to begin. "You said earlier that you know the neighborhood well," she started. "Intimately, even." Ray nodded. "I've walked that street for years, every day." "That's why I'm here." She took a slow breath. "Because your observations may be more important than you think. And what I'm about to show you, it's not easy to look at. But I believe you're someone who can handle it." His stomach tightened. He wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or a burden, but it didn't matter. He wasn't turning away now. McLean sat across from him and held up a photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but Ray recognized the house immediately. House 214. Except the photo wasn't from this week, or even last week. The angle, the faded color, the model of the car parked in the driveway, these belonged to years past. "This photo is from nearly 2 years ago," McLean said. "A surveillance image from a different case, something unrelated. Or so we thought." She tapped the corner. "Look closely at the man near the porch." Ray leaned forward. For a moment his breath stalled in his lungs. The man standing at the porch, his hat pulled low, his jacket zipped high, was unmistakable. The same sharp jawline, the same tall, stiff posture, the same presence he'd fought in the basement only hours before. "That's him," Ray whispered. "That's the same man." "Yes." McLean placed the photo on the coffee table, then pulled out another. A different house. A different state. Same man. Then another photo. Another house. Another child's sneaker lying abandoned on a porch. Each image built on the last, creating a thread that stretched farther and deeper than Ray could have imagined. "This man," McLean said, "is part of something large, something well organized. Child trafficking rings don't usually stay in one place. They move constantly. But they have patterns, safe houses, transfer points, places where they hide children before moving them again. And we believe Maple Leaf Street became one of those points." Ray felt the room spin. His eyes drifted toward the wall, unfocused, seeing not the beige paint but the cracks forming in everything he'd always believed to be safe. "But why here? Why this neighborhood?" "That's what we're trying to understand," she replied. "This street isn't random. None of the locations ever are. They choose quiet neighborhoods, stable communities, places where people trust each other so much they stop questioning unusual things, places where strangers might blend in because no one expects danger." Ray shook his head. "I noticed things. I always notice things. How didn't I see this sooner?" "Mr. Carter," McLean said gently, leaning toward him, "you saw everything that mattered. You saw the changes. You reported what felt wrong. You acted when others would have walked away. You didn't fail anyone." Ray swallowed hard. He wished he could believe that, but guilt had a habit of growing roots, thick, tangled roots that wrapped around the heart until reason had no room left. McLean exhaled, bracing herself. "There's more." She opened the file fully and slid a page toward him. A printed document filled with time stamps, vehicle descriptions, routes, surveillance logs, phone pings. Ray scanned it, confused, until he saw one detail that made his blood run cold. A license plate number. He knew it. It belonged to the dark SUV he had noticed idling at the far end of Maple Leaf Street only days ago, the one he had shrugged off as unimportant. The dent on the side, the tinted windows, the stillness. His hand trembled as he pointed. "I saw that car." "When?" "Yesterday morning," Ray whispered. "It was parked near the intersection, just sitting there. I didn't think anything of it, but I remember it clearly. The dent near the back tire, the way the engine was running but no one got in or out." McLean scribbled something quickly. "That SUV belongs to a man named Victor Dahl. He's wanted in 3 states in connection with child trafficking and illegal transport of minors. If he was here, it means your neighborhood wasn't just a stop. It was a hub." Ray's breath stuttered. "What about the Rileys? Did he—" "We don't know," McLean said. "But we have strong reason to believe they didn't leave willingly. And something else we found in the house supports that." She pulled out one final photograph. Ray stared, and the world seemed to tilt off its axis. It was a picture of the Rileys' living room, except the furniture was pushed aside, the rug rolled up. On the floor, faint but unmistakable, were drag marks, scratches in the hardwood where furniture had been shoved in a hurry, a broken vase, and something else, a small patch of dried blood near the baseboard. Ray felt the air leave his lungs. "No. We don't know whose blood it is yet," McLean said quickly. "It could be the suspect's. It could be accidental, but we're testing it." Ray leaned back, staring at the ceiling, his vision blurred. He imagined Megan's laughter echoing through that same living room, the soft classical music playing during summer mornings, the lavender pot by the steps. All of it replaced with violence, with fear, with someone else's footsteps claiming the space. "This is my fault," Ray said hollowly. "I should have—" "No," McLean interrupted firmly. "Don't go down that road. You stopped them before more damage was done. You saved a child, and now we have leads we didn't have before. That's because of you." Ray said nothing, staring at the file. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, watching everything he'd known crumble below him. McLean closed the file slowly. "I need your help, Mr. Carter. Your memory, your instincts. You said you noticed details. Well, son, we need those details. Anything strange from the past few weeks. Cars, people, deliveries, unusual packages, anything." Ray thought hard. His mind, though tired and shaken, searched through its internal archive with surprising clarity. The neighborhood map he'd built over decades unfolded in front of him like an enormous tapestry. Every car, every sound, every shift. "There was a white van," he began, "parked near the Riley's house last Thursday. No logo, no plates on the front." McLean wrote quickly. "Anything else?" "A man with a limp walking a dog I didn't recognize. A couple I'd never seen before leaving the Rileys from the side gate. And—" He paused. "And what?" McLean asked. "There was a letter," Ray whispered. "A misdelivered letter. It had no return address, but it was marked urgent. I assumed it was a mistake and left it in the Rileys' box even though their name wasn't on it. It had a symbol on the envelope, something like a looping spiral." McLean's pen froze mid-stroke. "What kind of spiral?" she asked slowly. Ray grabbed a notepad from his coffee table and sketched it, a curved line looping into itself twice, like a stylized hurricane. McLean's face paled. "What?" Ray asked, dread filling the pit of his stomach. "That symbol," she said quietly, "belongs to a trafficking organization we've been tracking for over 5 years. Very secretive, very mobile, very dangerous." Ray stared at the sketch, heart hammering. "So, they were targeting the Rileys specifically?" "Possibly," McLean said, "or using their home because of its location. But either way, you were right, Mr. Carter. Something was very wrong long before today." Ray felt sick. McLean stood. "There's more I need to investigate, but you'll be hearing from us soon. Don't leave town. And if you remember anything at all, call me immediately." Ray nodded numbly. McLean opened the door, pausing for just a moment before stepping out. "You're part of this now," she said softly. "Not because you want to be, but because you did the right thing. And that means we need you." The door closed. Ray sat motionless for a long time, letting the weight of her words sink into him. The sun had risen fully now, filling the apartment with warm light that felt painfully at odds with the darkness unraveling around him. He stood slowly, walking to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. Cars passing, people walking dogs, life moving as though the world hadn't shifted beneath their feet. But Ray knew better. His neighborhood was no longer the safe, predictable place he had memorized so carefully. It was something else now, a stage where shadows had gathered, where evil had taken root under the cover of routine. And he had walked through those shadows unknowingly, delivering mail while children were being moved, hidden, held against their will. The guilt pressed down on him like a weight. But beneath it, another feeling flickered. Determination. He wouldn't sit still. He wouldn't retreat. He wouldn't pretend ignorance. He would do what he'd always done. Pay attention. Notice things others didn't. Remember what others forgot. If the police needed him, he would help. If the Rileys were still out there, he would find them. If children were still missing, he would not rest until they were safe. He wouldn't let fear win. Not here. Not on Maple Leaf Street. Not ever. Ray closed his eyes, took a long breath, and opened them again, his mind already replaying every detail from the past weeks with renewed focus. For a long time after Detective McLean left, Ray remained pressed to the window, staring blankly at the world beyond the glass as though it might shift shape again, revealing the hidden patterns he now knew had always been there. The early afternoon light filtered through thin clouds, casting soft shadows across his living room, but none of it felt comforting. The quiet wasn't the same kind of quiet he'd known before. Pleasant, suburban, mundane. This quiet was the silence of something ominous waiting to be understood. The breath the world held before the next blow struck. He stepped back from the window and let himself sink onto the sofa, hands trembling slightly. The file still lay on the coffee table, photos spread out like shards of a broken mirror. Each one reflected something different. A face, a house, a symbol. But together they formed a picture far larger than he could process. The looping spiral he had drawn stared back at him, its curvature almost mocking, as if it knew the weight it carried, the lives it represented, the horror it had mapped across states. Ray reached out and touched the paper gently, tracing the lines he'd drawn. There was something familiar about it beyond the brief memory of that misdelivered envelope. Something tugged at the back of his mind, a small, persistent itch he couldn't quite scratch. He closed his eyes, inhaling slowly, trying to steady his heart. That symbol, the black SUV, the limping man, the white van with no plates. They weren't random pieces, they were parts of the same machine. A machine that had been moving quietly through his neighborhood while he carried mail, waved at children, and admired flowers. It made him feel both furious and helpless, emotions wrestling inside him like storms colliding. Ray stood abruptly, pacing the room. He hated sitting still, hated feeling useless. He paused near a bookshelf, resting a hand on its edge to steady himself. His ribs throbbed with every breath, a bruised reminder of the fight in the basement. But pain meant he had survived, and surviving meant he could still do something. He moved to his kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, though his hands were unsteady enough that some splashed onto the counter. He took a long drink, hoping the cold would clear the fog in his mind. It didn't. Not completely, but it grounded him just enough. He needed to think. He needed to remember. He closed his eyes and replayed the past 2 weeks like a film reel. The SUV, the white van, the strangers at the Rileys, the letter with the spiral. And then something else flickered. An image so quick, so seemingly inconsequential, he wasn't sure if it was real. A sound. A hum. An unfamiliar generator-like hum he'd heard early one morning coming from behind House 214. He had dismissed it as construction work several blocks away. But was it? He leaned forward, gripping the counter tightly. What if they had been setting something up? What if the Rileys' home had been slowly transformed over weeks, and he hadn't pieced it together until it was too late? Ray's thoughts spiraled, but he forced himself to breathe, to regain composure. He had to be methodical. He had to treat his memories like evidence, not chaotic fragments. He sat back down at the table and grabbed a notebook. He listed everything he remembered, no matter how small. Dates, times, descriptions, sounds, even the weather. The pages filled quickly, his handwriting growing slightly crooked as he hurried to capture the thoughts before they slipped away. He paused when he reached the detail about the limping man. That image stuck with him. The man walking a dog, a golden retriever if he remembered correctly. But something about that had felt off. No one on Maple Leaf Street owned a dog that large. He would have known. He remembered every pet on the block by name. The dog had been panting heavily, tongue hanging lopsidedly, and the leash was too short for a dog that size, as if it had been borrowed or improvised. Was the dog even his? Ray murmured out loud. He closed his eyes, trying to picture the dog's collar. Something silver, something with tags, a flash of light reflected in the sunlight. But the image blurred before he could make sense of it. He wrote it down anyway. He wrote everything down. By the time he finished, the afternoon light had shifted. The shadows in the room grew longer, stretching like tired limbs across the carpet. Ray leaned back in the chair, rubbing his eyes. His whole body ached, but his mind felt sharper now, fueled by urgency and something deeper: responsibility. He looked at the clock, nearly 4 p.m. Detective McLean would likely be deep in the investigation by now. Should he call her? Or should he wait until he had something more concrete? He didn't know the rules of police procedure, and he didn't want to burden her with speculation. But what if one of these details was important? What if it was the missing piece? He was debating the idea when a new sound cut through the quiet of his apartment. A soft tap at the window. Ray froze. Tap, tap, tap. He turned slowly, heart thudding, expecting, he wasn't sure what. The kidnapper's accomplice? Another threat? But when he approached the window cautiously and parted the curtains just enough to see through, he found himself staring into a pair of wide, anxious eyes. A child. But not just any child. The boy from the basement. Ray stumbled backward, startled. The boy pressed a hand against the glass, mouthing something Ray couldn't hear. Ray hurried to unlock the window and slide it open. "What? How? What are you doing here?" Ray stammered. The boy climbed inside quickly, trembling, breathing fast. His clothes were still dirty, though someone had clearly removed the duct tape and wiped the dirt from his face. His hair was messy, his cheeks streaked with dried tears. And despite the exhaustion in his eyes, he was alert, terrified, but purposeful. "They took her," he whispered urgently. Ray knelt in front of him. "Who? Who did they take?" The boy swallowed hard, and his eyes brimmed with fresh tears. "The lady. From the hospital. The one who helped me." Ray's heart dropped. "The paramedic?" The boy nodded vigorously. "2 men. They grabbed her when the police weren't looking. They put her in a van. The white van." Ray felt his blood turn cold. "How did you get away?" he asked softly, trying not to overwhelm the trembling child. The boy sniffed. "They didn't see me. I hid in the bushes. Then I ran. I remembered your name. The officer said it. I remembered your face. I thought you could help." Ray felt something inside him tighten, like a string pulled taut. This wasn't just about the Rileys anymore, or the boy. This was bigger. The traffickers were trying to erase evidence, eliminate loose ends, and one of those loose ends had just climbed through his window. "We need to call Detective McLean," Ray said, reaching for his phone. But the boy grabbed his arm urgently. "No!" he cried. They said if I talked to the police, they'd come after me. They said they know where to find me." Ray knelt, putting both hands gently on the boy's shoulders. "Listen to me. You're safe now. They won't hurt you again." The boy shook his head furiously. "You don't know them. They always come back. They find everyone." Ray's heart ached at the raw terror in the boy's voice. Whatever he had endured, it was far worse than anything Ray could imagine. "It's okay," Ray said. "You're not alone anymore." But even as he said it, a part of him trembled. Because deep down, he knew the boy wasn't wrong. If this organization had been lurking in his neighborhood for weeks or months, they could be anywhere. Watching, listening, waiting. He needed to think. Fast. "Do you know where they took her?" Ray asked. The boy hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I saw a map," he whispered. "In the basement. Before they moved me. There were marks, red marks. One of them looked like a barn. There was a number 42, or something like that." "A barn," Ray echoed. "Around here?" "Yes," the boy said. "The man with the hat? He said something about the barn drop before he took me to the house." The barn drop. Ray didn't know the term, but it didn't sound like anything good. He stood abruptly, adrenaline surging through his veins. The boy flinched at the sudden movement, and Ray immediately softened his posture. "Sorry," he said gently. "I didn't mean to scare you." The boy nodded. Ray paced the room again, thinking. Map. Barn. Number 42. Could it be a county route? A farm? A storage facility? Something rural? He didn't know enough about the outskirts of town to make the connection immediately. But someone did. Detective McLean. Ray grabbed the notebook from the table and tucked it inside his coat. He turned to the boy. "Come with me. We're going to the police." The boy froze. "No. No. They'll find me." Ray knelt again, lowering his voice. "They already know you escaped. That means you're not safe here. But Detective McLean can protect you, and she can help us save the paramedic." "But what if they're watching?" the boy whispered. Ray looked toward the window, toward the street below. And then he felt it. A prickle at the back of his neck, the faint sense of being watched. A black SUV rolled slowly past his building, moving at an unnaturally cautious speed, the same SUV from before. Ray swallowed hard. "You're right," he whispered. "We can't stay here." He grabbed his keys, his coat, and gently guided the boy toward the back door. "Where are we going?" the boy asked. Ray took a deep breath. "To find Detective McLean." He opened the door cautiously, listening for footsteps, engines, anything. The parking lot was quiet. No SUV, no white van. Not yet. Ray tightened his grip on the boy's hand, his own heartbeat pounding like a drum. "We're going to end this," he whispered, "before they hurt anyone else." He ushered the child into the fading afternoon light, the shadows lengthening around them, the danger closer than ever. Ray pulled the back door closed behind him in absolute silence, his hand still wrapped tightly around the small, trembling fingers of the boy who had escaped death only by the width of a breath. The sky had already turned a deep violet, the kind of evening twilight that swallowed everything into shadow before the streetlights could catch up. Maybe it was simply the dusk, or maybe it was the way fear tinted the world darker around its edges. Ray couldn't be sure anymore. Every sense in his body was tuned to the same quiet alarm. Danger was closing in. They slipped along the line of parked cars behind the apartment complex, keeping their backs to the wall like two silhouettes trying to fold themselves into the bricks. The boy was trembling so hard, Ray could feel it through his sleeve. But he didn't cry. Maybe fear had wrung every tear out of him long before he reached Ray's window. Every movement they made felt louder than it should. Every gust of wind through the alley felt like footsteps coming for them. They reached Ray's old silver sedan, scratched on the rear door, outdated but dependable. Ray opened the passenger door quietly, ushering the boy in, fastening his seatbelt with the same care he might have used on a newborn. Only then did he circle the car, eyes scanning the dim lot for movement. Nothing. No SUV, no white van. No shadow stepping out from behind the dumpster. He slipped into the driver's seat and shut the door with a controlled click. "You okay?" he whispered, keeping his voice steady. The boy nodded, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. A hollow look, carved deep by terror no child should ever have to wear. Ray started the engine. The soft rumble of the motor filled the cab with a strange comfort. He hoped it comforted the boy, too. "We're going to find Detective McLean," Ray said gently. "She'll help us." The boy's voice shook. "Are you sure?" Ray gave a tired but warm smile. "I'm sure." The truth was, he wasn't completely sure, but he needed to be. For the boy. For himself. As they pulled out of the lot, Ray dialed McLean's number. Once. Twice. 3 times. Declined. On the 4th attempt, the call didn't even ring, just cut straight to silence. A cold knot twisted in Ray's stomach. Where was she? Why wasn't she answering? They drove out of Portland, the city giving way to the empty plains and low fields of late autumn. The road stretched long and dark ahead of them, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the gathering night. Shadows fluttered across the fields like torn pieces of sky drifting too close to earth. The boy hugged himself, pulled small in the seat, as if trying to disappear. And then Ray saw it. A faded green road sign, County Route 42. He slammed the brake without thinking. The boy gasped. "What's wrong?" Ray stared at the sign, breath stuck in his throat. "You said the number 42. The boy blinked. "Yeah. And you mentioned a barn." The boy nodded again, slower this time, as if sensing Ray's realization. Ray looked left. Out across the windswept field was a lone barn, large and sagging with age. Metal roof rusted, entire boards missing from the sides. It stood like some dying animal, hunched and hollow. "Does it look like the one you saw?" Ray asked quietly. The boy stared hard through the windshield, and then his face went pale. "Yes, that's it." Ray didn't waste another breath. He turned onto the dirt path. Every jolt of the car over the uneven ground shook through Ray's bones, but he kept going until they'd crept within 30 meters of the barn. He shut off the engine. Darkness swallowed them instantly. He leaned over, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Stay here. Lock the doors. Only open if I say your name. Understand?" The boy swallowed. "Will you come back?" Ray looked into those frightened eyes. "I promise." He stepped out into the cold wind, pulling his coat tight, and scanned the barn. From inside came muffled sounds, metal shifting, boots scraping, a breathless moan, and then he heard her, the paramedic. The young woman who had helped the boy. Her voice trembled through the gaps in the boards. Ray pressed himself against the wall, listening. 3 men at least, one ordering the others, one tying something, one pacing like a predator. "Truck will be here in 10 minutes, the cold-voiced man said. "Get her ready, and find the kid. He can't have gotten far." "We know," another replied. "Don't worry." Ray's jaw clenched. He scanned the area and spotted a shed to the right of the barn. He slipped into it and sifted through the dusty, forgotten farming tools. His fingers closed around a rusted crowbar. Heavy. Rough. Real. He exhaled once. Then moved. Ray didn't remember breaking the door, only the cracking sound of splintered wood. Shouts erupted inside as 3 figures spun toward him. He swung the crowbar with a force he didn't know he still had. The first man dropped immediately. The second lunged at him, but Ray ducked and slammed the bar into the man's ribs. Pain exploded in Ray's knees as the fight dragged on, but adrenaline kept him upright. Then the third man, the one with the cold steel voice, drew a gun. Everything froze. Ray saw the barrel lift. Then, a gunshot, a deafening crack, a spark of light. He didn't feel the bullet, not because it hit him, but because he suddenly saw the boy at the barn's entrance. "No!" Ray roared. The bullet struck the wood an inch above the boy's head. Ray hurled himself forward, striking the gunman's wrist with the crowbar. The gun skidded across the dirt. They collided, slamming into crates and beams. The man fought with brute strength, but Ray fought with something older, deeper. The memory of every child on Maple Leaf Street, the laughter of families who trusted him, the fear in the boy's voice. He could not lose. The man broke free and scrambled for the gun. Ray's body screamed in exhaustion. And then, a scream. The boy again. He had lifted a rock and thrown it at the man with everything he had. The man stumbled, disoriented for a single second, a single precious second. Ray seized it. He lifted the crowbar and swung. Once. The man collapsed. Silence fell over the barn, a heavy, breathless silence. Ray dropped the crowbar, chest heaving, vision blurring. The boy ran to him, clutching him in a trembling embrace. "You came back," the boy cried. Ray held him close. "I promised, didn't I?" His voice broke. He didn't care. He hurried to free the paramedic. When she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with tears, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of seeing a stranger who had no obligation do the impossible for her. Ray helped her up. "You saved us," she whispered. Ray gave a small, weary smile. "We saved each other." And then, sirens. Brilliant red and blue lights swept across the barn walls as squad cars careened onto the property. Officers stormed inside, securing the scene, dragging away unconscious men. Detective McLean burst into the barn, breathless, eyes wide with fear until she saw Ray. She rushed to him, kneeling beside him. For the first time since he met her, she looked deeply shaken. "Ray, I thought we weren't going to make it in time." Ray smiled faintly. "You're late." McLean laughed through tears. "You stubborn old man." Paramedics swarmed in, tending to everyone. The boy refused to let go of Ray's hand until they convinced him he was safe. Later, long after the barn had been emptied and the traffickers arrested, long after Ray had been treated and wrapped in a blanket and guided into the back of a patrol car, Detective McLean sat beside him, her expression soft. "You didn't just stumble into something, Ray," she said. "You tore it apart." Ray shook his head. "I just listened, noticed things." "That's why we needed you," she said. "Most people walk through life half awake, but you see things. And this time, seeing things saved lives." Ray looked down at his hands, bruised, scraped, but steady. A week later, headlines covered the story. Local mailman exposes child trafficking ring, saves 5 lives. The Rileys were found alive, shaken, injured, but alive. They wrote Ray a letter handwritten with gratitude that made him cry for the first time in years. Neighbors left flowers on his porch. Strangers mailed him postcards from all over the state. Children in the street ran to him when he made his rounds, hugging him as if he carried a piece of sunlight in his satchel. But none of that compared to the small, folded note he found in his mailbox one quiet afternoon. Written in uneven, childish handwriting. "Thank you, Mr. Ray. I'm not scared anymore, because you showed me that light is real." Ray pressed the note to his chest, eyes stinging. When he put on his mailbag the next morning and stepped onto Maple Leaf Street, everything looked different, brighter, fuller, alive in a way he had never seen before. Because now he knew the truth. He hadn't saved the neighborhood. The neighborhood had saved him too. He began walking, soft morning sun warming his back, and for the first time in a long time, Ray Carter felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not just delivering letters, but carrying hope from one doorstep to the next.